Though after World War II most people chose to ignore the fact, the Beetle began life in the 1930s as a pet project of Adolf Hitler. Once in power, Hitler was determined to bring Germany up to what he thought of as the modernity common in the United States and other advanced economies. From the outset, Hitler was determined to modernize Germany's roads. In the early 1930s, Germany was one of Western Europe's least motorized societies. In the first 6 years of the Third Reich, accident rates on German roads climbed to become Europe's highest. By May 1939, the regime had to admit defeat and set speed limits on all roads except the autobahns, still Europe's most terrifying roads. Hitler commissioned Austrian engineer Ferdinand Porsche to design an affordable car for ordinary people. Ambitious and politically skilled, Porsche secured Hitler's backing for a huge factory that emphasized streamlined production techniques. Hitler opened the Volkswagen factory near the village of Vorlesleben, in what is now Lower Saxony, in 1938. In time, an entire new town, Strength through Joy City, was to be built to house and serve auto workers. In his comprehensive history of the Beetle, the People's Car, Bernhard Rieger describes the elaborate groundbreaking ceremony held at the site. 50,000 spectators, most of whom had been transported to the deep countryside by special trains, set the stage for the hour-long ceremony broadcast live on national radio, Rieger writes. To reach American levels of car ownership, Hitler told the automobile show in Berlin in 1934, Germany had to increase the number of cars on its roads from 500,000 to 12 million. To the further dismay of German nationalists, the two most successful mass vehicle manufacturers in the country were based in the United States, Ford, which opened a factory in Cologne in 1931, and General Motors, which operated the Opel car factory at Rüsselsheim. By the early 1930s, Opel cars were dominating the passenger vehicle market in Germany, with 40% of annual sales. Hitler pursued motorization on several levels. Building the famous Autobahnen was one. Another was the promotion of motor racing. Hefty government subsidies brought German speedsters by Daimler-Benz and Auto Union victory in 19 of 23 Grand Prix races held from 1934 to 1937. Ideology played an important role. In the interests of national unity, the government replaced local regulations with a Reich-wide highway code. Far from straight-jacketing drivers, the 1934 code placed its trust in the Aryans' consciously willed subordination to the racial community's interests. On the road, owners of expensive cars had to put discipline and chivalry first and set aside outmoded class antagonisms. Jews, of course, couldn't be trusted to do this, so from 1938 on they were banned from owning or driving cars. The Labour Front campaigned to get Germans to join a Volkswagen savings scheme. People stuck red stamps worth 5 Reichsmarks each in official savings books until they reached the 990 Reichsmarks required to buy a Beetle. Over 250,000 people enrolled in less than 18 months. Impressive though this total seemed, it fell far short of what the regime envisioned. With this level of enrollment, the scheme would never even remotely have covered the costs of production. Most of the savers were middle class, and a third had a car already. The masses simply couldn't afford the level of savings required. Moreover, as Rieger points out, the mass reluctance to part with savings reflected anxiety about the Nazis' increasingly bellicose foreign policy. Ordinary Germans were right to be skeptical about the savings scheme. No individual who signed up ever got a Volkswagen, at least not from funds invested during the Nazi era. The money went into arms production. So, too, did the factory. Only 630 Beetles were made before the war, most snapped up by regime officials. In 1939, as the Reich was whisking Volkswagen workers off to labor on Germany's western fortifications, the Nazis were able to keep production going only by obtaining 6,000 laborers from Italy. They lived in wooden barracks. By September 1939, only 10% of the planned accommodations in Strength through Joy City had been completed. The Italians worked to build a military version of the Beetle. The Jeep-like Kübelwagen, or bucket wagon, saw service wherever German forces operated. The Schwimmwagen was an amphibious variant. After Germany's defeat, the factory and company town fell within the British zone of occupation. Ivan Hurst, a major in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers Corps, arrived to inspect the plant. He found that 70% of its buildings and 90% of its machinery were intact. The British zone had 22 million inhabitants owning a mere 61,000 motorcars, nearly two-thirds of them described as worn out. Railway track and rolling stock were in ruins. Needing rapid improvements in transport, the British military government ordered Hearst to restart Beetle production. Applying ideas and methods derived from British colonial experience in Africa, Hearst set to work, using existing factory staff. When denazification booted more than 200 senior managers and technical experts, Hearst found substitutes or had verdicts overturned, in a triumph of necessity over legality and morality typical of occupied Germany in the late 1940s. He also managed to recruit 6,000 workers by the end of 1946. But the resurrection had been too hasty. Mechanical and other problems dogged the cars. British auto engineers said the noisy, smelly, underpowered Beetle had no commercial potential. No one wanted to relocate the factory to Britain. So the Germans got the Volkswagen back. Strength through Joy City was renamed Wolfsburg, after a nearby castle, though some may have recalled that Wolf was Hitler's nickname among cronies, so the name could be read as Hitler's Fortress. Wolfsburg was crowded with refugees and expellees from the east, some of the 11 million ethnic Germans ejected from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern European countries at the war's end. Burning with resentment, they proved easy marks for ultra-nationalist agitators. By 1948, the neo-Nazi German Justice Party was garnering nearly two-thirds of the local vote, while vandals repeatedly daubed factory walls with swastikas and many ballot papers were marked with the words, "We want Adolf Hitler." As a new town, Wolfsburg lacked experienced politicians to counter extremist nostalgia. Only gradually were mainstream parties able to push the neo-Nazis back into the shadows. Heinrich Nordhoff aided in this, insisting that Germans' travails in the late 1940s were the result of a war that we started and that we lost. His frankness had limits. He did not mention the mass murder of Jews or other Nazi crimes. He even echoed Nazi language in urging workers to focus on achievement, Leistung, just as Hitler in 1942 had urged a battle of achievement for German enterprises in war production. Whatever the rhetoric, the workers certainly did achieve. While the badly damaged Opel and Ford factories were struggling to get production underway, the Volkswagen plant was already turning out Beetles in large numbers. Efficiency rose steadily during the 1950s as Nordhoff introduced full automation on lines pioneered in Detroit. In August 1955, the millionth Beetle rolled off the line, painted gold, bumper encrusted with rhinestones, before 100,000 onlookers. The Beetle represented for Germans the new landscape of desire, of the sober, conservative 1950s. At the same time, the Beetle was making giant inroads as an export, with an especially fruitful market in the United States. Sales of the Beetle, also called the Bug, took off in the US in the mid-1950s. By 1968, Volkswagen was shipping more than 500,000 Beetles a year across the Atlantic, accounting for 40% of production. At least 5 million Americans bought Beetles. By the 1970s, the car had even become a countercultural fixture, with aerospace engineer turned mechanic John Muir's How to Keep Your Volkswagen Alive selling more than 2 million copies. Foreign sales sustained the company as Germany's Beetle era ended. The 1973 to 1974 oil crisis, changing fashions, tough new safety regulations, and failure to maintain the pace of automation caused domestic sales to slump. With the end of the economic miracle, came the end of the Beetle. West Germans began to demand vehicles that were faster, roomier, more comfortable, more elegant. In 1978, the factory at Wolfsburg stopped manufacturing Beetles. In 1997, Volkswagen introduced a new Beetle, appealing to the American fashion for retro chic but making clear that this vehicle fully met 21st century motorists' demands, less flower. One meeting has occurred annually since the 1980s in Nuremberg at the scene of the 1930s Nazi Party rallies, in front of the rostrum where Hitler ranted. The Beetle has long since become globalized, detached for most people from its Nazi origins.